Shakyamuni Buddha. And so Buddha literally means the one who is fully awakened. And Shakyamuni, we can divide into two parts. Shakya is the clan or group of people where Siddhartha grew up in. And Muni can have many meanings. Here it means capacity or strength. So Shakyamuni Buddha is the fully awakened one from the Shakya clan who has the capacity or strength to help liberate the sufferings of others. And Shakyamuni Buddha then went on for the next, so he achieved enlightenment at age 35, and then he spent the next 45 years wandering around India teaching people what he had discovered. And when he did this, the various teachings he gave, we can group them into what's called the 3 turnings of the wheel. The very first teaching that the Buddha gave after achieving enlightenment was the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths is the foundation of all Buddhist traditions. And this is going to be, I think, the main topic for tomorrow evening. We'll unpack these and look at them in more detail. But very simply, the Four Noble Truths is really telling us what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, what is happiness, and what are the causes of happiness. And these Four Noble Truths, then, when we talk about happiness, or that genuine happiness, we're really talking about achieving personal liberation from suffering. And that is often referred to as achieving the goal of nirvana. And here, we said that the root cause of suffering is our distorted view of reality. And so we need to come to realize the nature of reality to achieve liberation. And here in the Four Noble Truths, it's said that the root fundamental ignorance is grasping to what's called self. And we'll look at later what that really means. But it's basically a false sense of me, person. We overinflate the sense of me. And we're grasping onto this what's called solid self. So if we want to achieve this goal of nirvana, we need to come to realize there's no such self. So then in the Vipassana practice, that is what we're coming to realize to achieve nirvana. And so the problem here in the Four Noble Truths is simply how we see ourselves as a person. We overinflate the sense of me. Which means actually how we see the world is not a problem. So in the Four Noble Truths teachings, there is an independent, objective world there. No problem how we see the world. The only problem is how we see ourselves as a person. We overinflate the sense of me. That's the problem. If we can fix that, we can achieve nirvana, liberation from suffering. But then in what's called the second turning of the wheel, the Buddha taught what's called the perfection of wisdom teachings. And here, he went a bit further and he said that actually how we see the world is also a problem. There is no independent objective world out there. And so then in the perfection of wisdom teachings, not only are we going a little bit deeper in Vipassana practice, but also here the goal of the spiritual path is enlightenment. Which is a little bit of a further step than nirvana, and we'll look at that difference a little bit later in the retreat. And to achieve this goal of enlightenment, we need to come to realize that there's no independent me, no independent world. And so that's this idea of emptiness. But this idea of emptiness is not so easy to understand. Because when we hear this idea of emptiness, that there's no independent me, no independent world, that nothing exists from its own side, when we hear that, it seems like what they're saying there is nothing really exists. And if we misinterpret emptiness to mean that, we fall to the extreme of nihilism and thinking that, well, okay, then emptiness means nothing really exists. So to help overcome that mistaken view of emptiness, the Buddha taught a third turning of the wheel called fine distinction. Because here in the Four Noble Truths, basically the Buddha said everything's real. There's independent me, independent world. Here, Perfection of Wisdom, he says nothing is real. There's no independent me, no independent world. To avoid mistakenly thinking that means nothing exists, in Fine Distinction, the third turning wheel, he said some things are real. Because here, we're saying there's no independent world because it's coming from the mind. Therefore here, since everything's coming from the mind, therefore the mind is real. But all the things that come from them are illusory. So this third turning of the wheel can be a little bit of a stepping stone from this one to this one. So also here, in this third turning of the wheel, they also talk about enlightenment. And they also talk about this idea of emptiness, but it's not the same meaning here as here. And so from these three turnings of the wheel, these various systems of teachings, then we have Buddhism spreading from India. And I'd like to talk now about how it spread. But before I do that, is there any questions here? So this is just a very brief summary, and we're going to look at this topic in some detail tomorrow evening, and then we'll touch on this, particularly this idea of emptiness on day 9. But is there anything there that's not clear? Yeah.
And number 3 is the nature of the Buddha nature?
So in this third turning of the wheel, actually, if we look at it in more detail, we can say there are 2 parts to it. One of them is this idea here that there's no external world at all. Everything's internal to the mind. So this is this teaching on what's called Chittamatra, mind only. There's a second part to the third turning of the wheel, which is this teaching on Buddha nature, which is really very much a bridge into Tantra or Vajrayana practice. So there are 2 aspects to the third turning of the wheel. So the one I only briefly mentioned here is the first one, this idea that there's no external world at all, but the mind is real in this context. So yes, there is the teaching on Buddha nature as well coming in here.
What's the
What's the time?
I don't think, I mean, even though this is the first, it's not like it's chronological. So remember, the Buddha taught according to people's capacity. So to these people he taught this, to these here. It's not like he taught this for 10 years and then this for 10 years and then this for... No. It's not... although the Full Noble Truth was the very first teaching he gave, but the teachings that sort of belong to this he taught throughout his life, and similarly here and here. So it's not like a distinct, separate chronological sequence.
Buddha nature also falls under there is one thing that exists and it is the mind? Because I know it's a bit different.
Yeah, so Buddha nature is a huge topic, and we can look at Buddha nature in a number of ways. And Buddha nature, really, the main teaching on that comes here. But again, we can understand Buddha nature in a number of different ways. And I want to briefly touch on that Buddha nature in the context of emptiness a little bit in day 9. Was there a specific question?
Just that you said that Buddha nature is under the third turning of the wheel, which is Shamatha, but it's...
only one part of that. So there's 2 parts to here. One part is Shamatha, the other part is Buddha nature.
And is Buddha nature also say that only the mind exists, or is
No.
it something else?
The Buddha nature teaching, you can interpret in that way. You could interpret Buddha nature in terms of this Chittamatra idea. That's one way of interpreting it, but there are a number of ways. Another way of interpreting Buddha nature is very much in line with the perfection of wisdom understanding. So there are a number of different interpretations of what Buddha nature really means. And even here, we can look at Buddha nature from sort of 2 angles as well. So there are a number of different ways of looking at Buddha nature. Okay. So then when Buddhism spread from India, remember I said it spread through 2 languages, Pali and Sanskrit. So when Buddhism first spread from India, it spread through the Pali language. And the teachings that spread through the Pali language were coming really from this first turning of the wheel, 4 Noble Truths. And so the Pali, the teachings that spread through Pali, again, based on 4 Noble Truths. And this is what spread initially to Sri Lanka, and then up through Southeast Asia into Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and so forth, down through Southeast Asia. And so all of these Buddhist traditions collectively now are known as Theravada Buddhist traditions. And so, as we've seen here, then in Theravada Buddhist traditions, the final goal of the spiritual path is nirvana. But also Buddhism spread through the Sanskrit language. And when it spread through the Sanskrit language, it was really mainly based on this perfection of wisdom teachings. Perfection of wisdom in Sanskrit is called prajna paramita. And these teachings initially spread up through the northwest of India, and went over the Himalayas in now the area of Afghanistan, Pakistan. Went up over the Himalayas onto the Silk Route And then they went across the Silk Route into China, Korea, Japan, and down to Vietnam. And then at a later time, they also went again over the Himalayas into Tibet and also Mongolia. And so these Buddhist traditions now that are based on the Sanskrit texts collectively now are known as the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. And as we've seen here in the Perfection of Wisdom teachings, the final goal of the spiritual path is enlightenment. And the assertion here is in the Mahayana traditions is that enlightenment is a further step than nirvana, one more step. And we'll look at the difference there a little bit later. So these are the what's called the Theravada Buddhist traditions and the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. When Buddhism spread into Tibet, it spread initially in the 8th century. And actually when Buddhism spread to Tibet, we end up with 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism. Buddhism first spread in the 8th century into Tibet, and it's particularly spread through great Indian master Padmasambhava. And the core teachings that he passed on into Tibet is a system of teachings called Dzogchen. And these system of teachings form the basis of what's now called the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism. Nyingma is a Tibetan word meaning old school or original school. So this was the first school of Buddhism in Tibet, and the system of practice there is called Dzogchen. And then after that time, the next few centuries, a king came to power who didn't like really Buddhism, tried to wipe it out. So for a couple of centuries, Buddhism went a little bit underground in Tibet. And then around the 10th, 11th century, another wave of Indian masters came over the Himalayas into Tibet to revitalise Buddhism in Tibet. And through their efforts, we have the other 3 schools being formed. The second school is called the Kagyu school, and the system of practice that was brought into Tibet here is called Mahamudra. Mahamudra, like Dzogchen, has an emphasis on focusing on the mind itself, and so these 2 systems of practice are often called nature of mind practices. Then we have another system of practice being brought into Tibet called Lam Dre. Lam means path, Dre means result. So Lam Dre means paths and results. And that system of practice formed the basis of the Sakya school of Tibetan Buddhism. And then we have another system of practice being introduced into Tibet called Lam Rim. Again, Lam means path, Rim means stages. So Lam Rim is the stages of path to enlightenment. And this system of practice forms the basis of what's called the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism. These 3 schools, Kagyu, Sakya, Gelug, came into Tibet much later than Nyingma. So these three schools together collectively are called the Sama schools. Sama means new school. Nyingma means old school, original school. Now, His Holiness Dalai Lama himself belongs to the Geluk school, but he's considered to be the spiritual leader of all four schools. So these are the four schools of Tibetan Buddhism. So is there any questions about any of this here?
What is our school?
Our school, our school. What's my school? My school.
We want to know
I mean, myself personally, I did a lot of my initial studies in the Geluk school. So my first few courses were in a Geluk centre, and then I did my 7 years study within a Geluk centre. But then since then, spending a lot of time in India, I've been received quite a lot of instructions from teachers within the Kagyu school. So I have some experience with Mahamudra system of practice, and then more recently I've received a number of instructions, teachings particularly from Alan Wallace, who's following the Dzogchen tradition. So now I have a little bit of experience in the Dzogchen system of teachings. I don't really have any much teachings on the Sakya, although last week, of course, here the Sakya Treason was here, and he gave a little bit of teaching in that. So that's one of the very few times I've actually received any teachings from a Sakya master.
So what is the difference with you?
Oof.
A little bit, you have to
Okay.
say a sentence.
Okay. What's the difference between the four schools? Of course, all the schools in Tibetan Buddhism are Mahayana, of course, coming from Sanskrit tradition, so they all have the same goal of enlightenment. So that's the same. But one way of looking at the differences here is a little bit in terms of perspective. For example, using an analogy, let's say we've got a window there that's got some dirt on it. One perspective is to say, there's a dirty window, I need to put some effort to make that window clean. And that's often the perspective we have. But equally well, we could say, well, actually, there's already a clean window there. All we need to do is remove the dirt to reveal the clean window that was always there. That's also valid, but a different perspective. And that's a little bit the difference here, is that particularly in the Geluk school, we tend to have the first perspective, that the dirty window, we need to put effort to produce a clean window. So that here is the perspective of, here we are, there's the goal of enlightenment, we need to put effort in these stages of the path practices to move forward to that goal of enlightenment. So we're looking forward on the spiritual path. Whereas particularly the Nyingma and Kagyu have the opposite perspective. The perspective of there's a clean window already there, we just need to remove the dirt to reveal what was already there. So they have the perspective of that there is a Buddha within already. The Geluks say we need to put all this effort, then we'll become a Buddha. The Kagyu and the Nyingma say, well, actually there's a Buddha already within. We just need to remove these obscurations to reveal the Buddha that was already there. So they have the perspective of the resultant state, looking back on the spiritual path. And Sakyas are sort of a little bit of in between those two perspectives. And that actually touches on this point of Buddha nature that we just briefly mentioned. We can see Buddha nature from these two perspectives. Buddha nature here in Geluk means we have the potential for enlightenment. The potential for enlightenment is within all of us. Whereas in the Kagyu Nyingma, Buddha nature means there's a Buddha within already. We just need to remove the dirt to reveal the Buddha that was already there. So Buddha nature here is not potential. It's the Buddha that's already there within us. Both of those perspectives have advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage with this perspective, that Buddha nature is potential, I have to put a lot of effort to achieve that goal of enlightenment. The disadvantage is we look at all that and we go, oof, I have to do all that effort and that goal of enlightenment is so far away. I think that's impossible. I can't do it. Too much effort necessary. Whereas the disadvantage with the Dzogchen Mahamudra perspective is there's a Buddha already within. I don't need to do anything. I'm already enlightened. And so we don't do anything. So both of these have, and of course it's not one's valid and one's invalid. They're both valid. They're two different perspectives of the same thing. And both have advantages and disadvantages. Any other questions?
And do they all practice Tantra?
Okay. So these three turnings of the wheel here is all what's called Sutra, the teachings of the Buddha. Then we can talk about Tantra, which also the Buddha taught. But when these teachings, these teachings were the ones that were most widely taught because it's most easy to understand. So this is what spread widely in India. These teachings here, particularly teaching on emptying, is not so easy. So this wasn't so widely taught. So that took some time for those teachings to really develop in India. And Tantra is like right up there. So that was hardly taught at all and took a long time for it to really take hold in India. And what we find is that when Buddhism spread from India through both the Pali and Sanskrit languages, and most of that spreading happened from a couple of hundred years up until, from the first up to about the 6th century. That's when the big spread of Buddhism happened in those centuries to all of these countries, to Burma, to Laos, to Cambodia, Thailand, but also to China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam. So that spread, most of those countries had Buddhism by the 6th century, 6th, 7th century. Tantra or Vajrayana in India only really started to really be developed or widely practiced from the 8th century onwards. So Buddhism had already spread to most countries except Tibet. Buddhism first started to spread to Tibet in the 8th to the 11th century. That was the sort of the peak of tantric practice in India. So when Buddhism spread into Tibet through the Sanskrit language, not only do we have all these teachings, we also have Tantra going with that as well. So actually now, and then of course in the 12th century, basically Buddhism got wiped out in India. So therefore, my understanding is now Tantra or Vajrayana in its fully developed form only still exists in Tibet. Some of the other systems have it a little bit, but not in a really fully developed form. You'll only find that in Tibetan Buddhism, and of course Tantra or Vajrayana is the highest level of practice in all 4 schools. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are there other schools of Mahayana? Are there other Mahayana schools besides the Tibetan schools?
Yeah, so the Mahayana includes, of course, Chinese Buddhism, Zen, Korean, Vietnamese, Mongolian. These are all Mahayana traditions. They're all based on Sanskrit and the perfection of wisdom teachings.
Where do you put the schools of the Svatantika and all this?
Okay, right. So from these teachings, we have different ideas, particularly about nature of reality, because this is according to people's capacity. And from these teachings, then what we find is that in ancient India, philosophical systems